All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode number 279 of the Restoring Rapport podcast. We are super excited for the content we got planned out for you guys today, as always. This is a podcast for young believers who are pursuing the goal of marriage and family and trying to get married as young as possible in a healthy way. I'm your host, Seth Hensley. I come on twice a week, every week on Thursday and Sunday to discuss not only the benefits of kind of getting married young, but I also try to equip and encourage you in your pursuit of that goal. And today we're going to be reviewing an article that was published by the Gospel Coalition entitled Marriage Isn't Rehab for Sexual Sin. It was published on March 22nd of the year 2023 by Rutledge Eldridge III. And the reason that this article stuck out to me is marriage really is God's design for a healthy sexual life. And I've talked about that in hundreds of episodes before this one. So if you have not heard those, be sure to go back and listen to those. Just search Restoring Rapport and all in whatever podcast platform you use, or my name, and all the episodes we've done will come up on this issue. You can just look through the ones that relate to the issue of marriage as God's design for a healthy sexual life. And really, when I hear arguments from a Christian perspective that seem to kind of undermine the idea that God's, design for a healthy sexual life is the only way that God designed a healthy sexual life to be is in the context of a marriage. It seems to kind of, it rubs me the wrong way. And I know that this is a Christian organization, the Gospel Coalition. And they're definitely not saying that, marriage is not God's design for a healthy sexual life. But what they are saying, what I suspect they may say in this article is that, essentially getting married does not fix sexual dysfunction. And kind of I disagree with that, guys. I really do. And I know that, the obvious rebuttal to that argument is the idea that, there are people who are in a marriage and they're addicted to porn, or they, cheat on their spouse, or they have some unhealthy sexual coping mechanism. And I'm not saying that marriage guarantees, a healthy sexual life. That's not the argument I'm making. But I am saying that marriage is God's solution for the sexual drive that He's given you. And to ignore marriage as a calling on your life, if you have a strong sexual drive, I think is a fool's errand and a bad idea, and something that needs to be commonly acknowledged as not a good idea by the Christian community. So anytime that I read a title that basically makes marriage seem like less of a good idea when it comes to living a healthy sexual life, I always get curious and want to read that and give another alternate perspective. So if you would like to follow along with the video content that we're producing and actually read the article with me, you can go to YouTube and watch this episode, or you can subscribe to the show for $5 a month and get early access to this episode on whatever on Spotify if you use that podcast platform. And I'm really excited for this article, like I said, because I learn just kind of as much as you guys when I read these, because these are things, this podcast, one of the great things about it is it's been a way for me to actually discipline myself to consume good content, because I don't often find the time to just, I don't know about you, but sit down and read an article. Like, I do not do that. I don't find the time to just sit down. And again, that's probably a flaw on my end, but one way that I can discipline myself to make time to read is to, create a podcast where I actually have to read to get content. And so this is one way I've done that. So this is good for me, not just you. And I hope that it benefits you and provides value for you. If it does, please reach out and send me what kind of, let me know what kind of value it generated for you. I would love to hear that. It'd make me feel super connected to you as always. I really want to be hearing from you guys. The way, again, that you can do that if you are new here and you haven't heard me say it a million times is going to the link in the show notes. We have a link in the show notes that says send this podcast a voice message. Just click on that link and record me a 30-second message telling me your thoughts on the episode or anything I talk about. I would love to hear your perspective on. Even if you disagree, I would love to hear those. It would just make me feel more connected to you and make this podcasting thing two-way. So really appreciate that. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. Again, the title of the article, as you can see on your screen if you're subscribed, is Marriage Isn't Rehab for Sexual Sin. And I react to that because, again, I think marriage is God's solution and God's intention for, a healthy sexual life. And so anytime, I think that article title makes it basically seem, like less of a solution than it really is. And so let's just see exactly what this author means by that, though, because sometimes titles can be misleading. It says, so often Christians who are overwhelmed by sexual sin are practically shoved down the aisle by their church communities. Pastors may tell couples that once they're bound within a biblically legitimate marriage relationship, sexual activity has Scripture's seal of approval, and they can work together on whatever besetting sexual sins they bring into the union. Okay, I've never said and never will say that it's a good idea to get married with a porn addiction. I've never said that, never will say that. I think that's a terrible idea. But what I do think is true is that when the genuine article is present, counterfeits lose their power. And here's what I mean by that. Let me give the analogy of a man in the desert who's been basically, going without water for weeks, and he is dying. He is literally dying. And if he comes across swamp water in his arid situation, because of his desperation, he will drink that water regardless of its purity or its cleanliness or whatever quality it might have. He doesn't care because it's water, even if it's bad water, is basically my point. And so a man who is living in comfort and living in, wealth, who's living in an oasis, is not going to drink that water because he has the real deal, right? And sexual sin is much the same. Sexual sin is afforded temptation by the fact that you do not have the real version of a healthy sexual life. People struggle with sexual sin when they don't have the genuine article, when they don't have an actual healthy sexual life. And because I think marriage is the only, healthy context for a healthy sexual relationship, this leaves young people, particularly young singles, in a very serious situation, because here they are beginning to have these drives, these God-given, I would say, drives, to procreate and to, propagate the species and to build a family and have a wife and have closeness and intimacy with another person. And yet there's every way that's presented to them to fulfill those desires by culture is dangerous and wrong and immoral and sinful. Pornography, hookup culture, these things not only do they provide, I would say, a less than the best sexual experience for all parties involved, but they don't give you everything that a healthy sexual life can be, but they're actually, I would say, immoral. And so, and you would agree with me as a young believer listening to the show. If you don't agree with me, you probably have some fundamental worldview disagreements with me, and this show is probably not for you. But again, this show is for young believers, so followers of Jesus Christ who read Scripture and take it very seriously. You're going to agree with me on that these immoral forms of sexuality are wrong. And I think there's kind of two things that happen within mainstream Christianity when it comes to the discussion of sexual health. Most people pretend like sexual, drives and desires do not exist until you get married, which is wrong. They do, and that's why people are addicted to porn, and that's why people hook up and commit adultery and all this other stuff, is because they have a need, a God-given need, and instead of following God's prescription for that need and God's design for that need and that purpose, they follow the world's. They follow their own. They follow, fill in the blank, some other prescription for that problem, instead of following, again, God's solution for that problem. And so, we have lots of young people today who have these really unhealthy sexual habits that they're forming in their young years because they have God's desire, which I would say is an indicator to them that they need to be moving towards the goal of marriage and not postponing marriage later in the future. That's yet another reason to get married young, like we talk about on the show a lot. But so they're doing that, and that whole time that they're postponing marriage, they're coping with the sexual drive God's given them by using very sinful means of satisfying that drive. And so, pastors, I don't see pastors often encouraging people to get married to avoid sexual sin. Instead, I see pastors encouraging people not to make their spouse an idol, or saying something equally, I would argue, irrelevant. It is possible, yes, to make your spouse an idol, but it's not a problem that we're seeing today. A problem that we are seeing today is people with unhealthy sexual habits as a result of them not pursuing God's design for them in marriage. And so let's continue and see if this guy says anything different than that as we move into the article. He says, but as the newlyweds soon discover, marriage tends to amplify, not alleviate, besetting sin. This is absolutely false. I haven't even been tempted by pornography since I married Lainey, even since I dated Lainey. This is just an incorrect statement. He says, as the newlyweds soon discover, marriage tends to amplify, not alleviate, besetting sin. That is incorrect. I struggled with porn at least as much as every other man prior to meeting my wife. At least as much, maybe more. I'm not even talking about my sexual drive has no relevance in this conversation, but his statement is incorrect because this is my story. As literally, I have not struggled at all with immoral sexual actions since I had Lainey, since I met Lainey and married her. Isn't that amazing, guys? It's not something profound. And I'm not saying that again. I'm not saying that just having a spouse fixes all sexual problems. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that's God's mode for a healthy sexual life. That's God's mode for a healthy sexual life. So if you literally find yourself, if you've tried, let me tell you what I tried back when I was, let's see here, 14 to 19 to 20. In those years where I had no one and I still had a sexual drive, here's what I tried to do to use to basically prevent sin from getting a foothold in my life. I had accountability partners. I told mentors. I told friends. I told parents. I put Covenant Eyes on my phone and paid a monthly subscription to basically have a program take screenshots of my devices and send to people so that they would basically know what I was looking at. It was a huge accountability, and I think that's a great thing. I think Covenant Eyes is wonderful. It's an amazing program. But again, that doesn't solve the problem. That does not solve the problem. I tried, basically getting rid of all my devices. I tried, destroying devices. I tried restricting internet access. I tried, what else did I try? I tried everything you can I tried moving devices to a central location in the home with a lot of traffic so that there was never any alone time with devices. I tried everything. If there is a method out there for preventing porn addiction, when I was 14 to 19, I tried it. And none of them worked, except for one thing. One thing worked without fail. And I'm going to tell you guys that right here. And again, maybe you're not like me, and maybe you don't work like me, and you're not wired like me, and this method might not work for you. But if you're like me, I can guarantee you this method will work. Because since I got married, I have not struggled with porn even one time. Do you understand the significance of that? I mean, and again, some people who are skeptical will say, well, you've been married a year, you've been married a little over a year and a half or so. By year 3, you'll be struggling with porn again. And you know what? To those people who would say that, I'll see you on year 3 because I think you're wrong. And, it's basically at this point your word against mine. But what I can tell you for sure is that porn was a big struggle for me from 14 to 19 years old, even beyond then. It's not something that I was really never able to beat it in any regular sense for any, extended length of time. Marriage was what enabled me to never have a problem with that again for multiple reasons. Number one, I actually have a mode of sexual expression. When you're married, you have the genuine article that God has designed. So counterfeits, dirty water, in my analogy earlier, is totally unappealing. Filth is totally unappealing when you have a full 3-course meal, guys. And so, the easy way to deal with this is to not starve yourself. And, goodness, I think of when Jesus went into the wilderness and was tempted by the devil and he offered him bread. Why do you think he offered him bread in that situation? The reason he offered him bread in that situation is because that is literally when God himself was at his weakest, is when he was hungry and tired and was fasting and alone. That's when he was at his weakest. And you're much obviously not, acting totally like Christ yet. As a believer, you're in constant, growth and sanctification and maturity, whatever you want to call it. You're in constantly becoming more like Christ, but we would all agree that we are not, we don't have the strength of Jesus. And yet that's when the devil tried to get Jesus to make a mistake, was when he was at his weakest. And so to me, guys, the moral that we can draw from that story is you want to make yourself in a situation where you are not found by temptation weak. When temptation comes knocking, you want to be at your buffest, you know, and it's really common sense. Okay. And so let me just hammer this home. If you have the genuine article, a healthy sexual life in the way that God intended, married to a partner who has sworn never to leave you, you know, other less than sexual opportunities are going to be totally revolting to you and not tempting. Because again, you're not starving. You don't have, you know, you're not in a starving situation. You're weak when you're in a starving situation. And so young people who are not married are constantly in a starving situation because there is no healthy sexual expression, I would argue, outside of marriage. And so the solution to me is clearly encouraging young people to get married so that they can live the healthy sexual life God intended them for. And yes, I do acknowledge, I'm not saying everyone should get married. I do know there are scriptural reasons for remaining single, but those are abnormal and unique exceptions. Those are not the norm. Those are not the standard and should not be the standard for most of the young believers in the church. And so that's why I don't add that caveat in much. I'm talking to the majority of young believers in the church who actually have a sex drive and who actually are intended by God to marry. And so I think that, again, you know, one of the reasons that they should marry and marry as soon as possible in a healthy way is because they basically shorten their desert season and they don't attempt to fight off temptation in a state of starvation for 15 years, because that is how really unhealthy sexual habits gain a foothold. And the longer that you have those sexual habits, the harder they are to break. And so that's one of the reasons I think getting married young is a good idea. And number two, once you are married, another reason that porn and adultery and other unhealthy forms of sexual expression do not become difficult for you once you get married is because suddenly you have a woman's heart to protect. When you were, think about it, young men, those of you who aren't married, which is most of you listening right now, you won't understand this yet. But when you're single, you only have to worry about yourself and how pornography is affecting you and your own relationship with God. But once you cross the line into marriage, you now have to worry about how that pornography addiction or that sexual error that you made is going to affect your wife's confidence, your relationship with your wife, your wife's relationship with God. All of these things come into play because suddenly you're responsible not just for you, but for her. Okay? And so basically it becomes, the consequences are multiplied. Basically the consequences for sexual immorality are multiplied by getting married. And so in order for you to actually make a sexual error, you're going to have to do that knowing I'm breaking my wife's heart right now. I am ruining my relationship with my wife and my God right now in this moment. Not just my relationship, my own personal relationship with God, but I'm messing up my marriage and I'm messing up, the heart of this beautiful woman that God has entrusted me with. It's a lot harder to be stupid when you know that your wife could get hit by the train too. Do you understand that? And so, there's no better preventative for, I would say, sexual immorality than being married. And I will die on that hill. I've seen lots of adultery. I've seen it within marriages, yes, but it was way harder for those men to commit adultery in the context of marriage than it was for them to basically lust after a woman outside the context of marriage. I guarantee you that for every man who commits adultery within marriage, that man committed, lust and immorality and just all manner of filth with other people, prior to his marriage, infinitely more, because it's easier to do. It's easier to do wrong when you're not married. The consequences are less severe. The price of sin, I would say, is even, the wages of sin is death, yes, but the consequences in the real present time for sexual sin is lighter when you're single than it is when you're married. And so it's going to be harder for you to make those mistakes. It's going to be much harder because you know that you're taking your wife down with you. And my friend, will keep you in check. And again, I'm not guaranteeing, nothing I'm saying here is a guarantee. I'm not saying that just by getting married, you're solving sexual addiction for the rest of your life. I'm simply asking you, what's the best way to solve sexual sin? What is the best way to live in such a way that God is honored? What's the best way to live uprightly and be a man and live as a man of conviction. What is the best way to do that? Getting married is clearly the better option. Like sometimes I don't understand if people realize just how much easier it becomes. Okay, so not only do you have the genuine article of a healthy sexual life, not only does, sinning against God and you become even more difficult because suddenly you're hurting your wife by doing so, but just look at the numbers. You sinned way more before marriage than you did after. Even if you don't have my story and you've never had a problem with porn since you tied the knot, you probably, I would guarantee, you've sinned less as a married man than you had as an unmarried man. I would guarantee it. This is a universal truth, guys. And so, and again, I think it's an awful idea to get married with a porn addiction. I think it's an awful idea. But what I'm saying is that when I met my wife and we started a committed relationship with one another, I was not even tempted. That's what I'm saying. Do you understand? I was not even tempted. And so to dissuade people, young people, especially from getting married on the basis that, marriage isn't sexual rehabilitation, I think is a bad article title. And, so far this guy has not changed my mind. I'm open to him changing my mind, but I want to hear him basically kind of recount that because in my own personal experience, marriage is exactly what sexual rehabilitation should be. It is the real deal, right? It is not the counterfeit. It is not the fake. And it basically solves the problem in so many ways. And again, maybe you're not like me. But I'm just sharing my own personal story here. And hopefully it is, helping you. But he says, suddenly a relationship formed to honor God has all the makings of a human tragedy. I just don't agree. I disagree with this whole paragraph. He says, but newlyweds soon discover marriage tends to amplify, not alleviate besetting sin. That is totally not true in my book. Again, just to recap, I have not even been tempted with pornography, to a fraction of the extent that I was prior to getting married. I looked at porn for years, guys, just like every other man, out there. I would pretty much guarantee every other man out there, who is living without the genuine healthy sexual relationship is looking at porn. And I looked at that for years prior to being married. But once I entered that committed relationship with my wife, that sin lost its power. It really did. And I know what I'm saying is dangerous because there are people who, and I want to hammer this home, there are people who are looking at porn in their own marriage and who are cheating on their wife and who are cheating on their spouse. And I'm not saying that getting married fixes it 100% of the time, but I am saying that it is God's way to live a healthy sexual life. And I think that God's way comes with good rewards. And that has certainly proved true in my life. And again, maybe you're not like me, but maybe you are. So basically I'm obligated to tell you this because for the benefit of the people who are like me and who have my story, because if people would have encouraged me to get married instead of basically and giving me all these ways of suppressing, my sexual desire or trying to solve porn addiction that didn't work, I would have gotten, my life would be better way sooner because I would have made a wise decision way sooner. Okay. And so hopefully if you have my story, this article will help you, or not this article, but my review of it and my story. This author says, but doesn't the Apostle Paul tell the Corinthians that if they can't control their sexual desires, it is better to marry than to burn with passion? Why, yes, he does. That's another great scriptural reason to do this. Paul very clearly says that, and this guy clearly disagrees with that. And we're going to let him, inform us of his opinion here, but I disagree with him. I absolutely think Paul was right on the money there in 1 Corinthians 7 when he said this. If you're in a relationship and God's design is pushing you together, then you need to follow God's design and get married. You don't need to try and basically, fight these innate God-given desires for your partner. I think that's a stupid idea. To use the words of J.R.R. Tolkien in, I think it's The Return of the King, said by Captain Faramir, he says, there are some perils from which a man must flee. And he was wise enough to know that. And you need to be wise enough to know that too. There are some dragons that it's stupid of you to go and fight. And sexual sin is one of those dragons. You do not take fights with sexual sin. You basically prevent those fights from ever happening. Why? Because again, God made sexuality. Sexuality is a powerful thing that God designs to do that God designed to do powerful things. And when used correctly, it's a wonderful thing. And because it's a wonderful thing, the counterfeit of it is also a really bad thing, and it has lots of bad consequences and leads to death, right? And so, man, I would not recommend. I would recommend doing exactly what Paul describes. Again, just to use his words here, he says, "It is better to marry than to burn with passion." Man, and Paul wasn't the biggest, encourager of people getting married. He himself was unmarried and said that he had a special grace for that, and that he wished that lots of people could live like that, even though they couldn't. So he's not. It's not like Paul is some marriage freak who was encouraging every young believer in Corinth or in any other church, for that matter, of the early church to get married. He was definitely not doing that. I mean, at least not that we're aware of, and definitely not based on the scripture that we have. He was definitely not doing that. So the author says here, "Isn't marriage then God's prescription for dealing with sexual sin?" I wouldn't word it like that. Here's how I would word it. I would word it as God's prescription for a healthy sexual life is marriage. And so if you're struggling with an unhealthy sexual life, if you're struggling with unhealthy counterfeits of what a healthy sexual life can be, maybe you need the genuine article instead of that crap that you're eating, basically. And far too often, I see young believers turning down God's design for a healthy sexual life in favor of a prolonged battle with a dragon that they are too weak to even have a chance against. And that to me is just stupid. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? How many times do you need to lose against porn before you realize, hey, hang on a second, this dragon might be stronger than me? I need to flee this battle and not take this battle. And instead of taking this battle, I need to choose God's road for a healthy sexual life. Because maybe I'm intended, here's a shocking realization, maybe I'm actually wired by God as a sexual creature. And I have the choice to either act in an unhealthy way towards Him and other people, or I have the choice to act in a way that honors God with my body and honors other people with my body. And so instead of trying to run from the sexual battle altogether, we have to choose the right road, which is getting married to one person and growing a healthy sexual life with that person. Man, guys, this is good stuff. But I react to titles like this that dissuade people from choosing God's road for a healthy sexual life. It drives me up the wall. And I'm sure that's the last thing this guy actually meant to do. Because he probably agrees with me that marriage is the God-designed healthy sexual form, healthy sexual expression, and the only one in the world. But his prescription and his advice to young people on what they should do with their early years is quite different than mine. He's basically saying, well, he may say later in the article, I'm not sure yet, we'll find out, that you should, not get married if you have ever struggled or are currently struggling with porn, or he may say something like, if you're not ready for marriage, he may use that language. If you're not ready for marriage, that you should run the other way. And maybe that worked for some people. It certainly did not work for me. And so I'm just giving you an alternate perspective to this guy that's still from a Christian perspective. He says passion or sinful lust. In urging marriage as a biblical means of combating lust, the Rahab view fails to distinguish between godly desires and sin's parasitic perversion of them. He's termed my worldview evidently the Rahab view, which I'm not sure how I feel about. And again, I'm not saying, if you have a porn addiction, I'm not saying you should get married. I think you should fix the porn addiction first. But what I am saying is that porn loses its power when you actually have a real healthy relationship with a woman. Sorry. So when I met Lainey and we began bonding and I began, pursuing her with the goal of marriage in mind, I lost all desire to even look at pornography. I lost all desire. I had no desire whatsoever to look at porn, to look at another woman with lust in my heart. Lost it totally. I did not have it. And so I'm saying that, often that I'm not a totally unique guy. I'm not a weird, some anomaly. There are lots of guys like me out there. And so I think they may have a similar story. And this guy's article title is shooting them in the foot and basically encouraging them to prolong their battle with a dragon that they can never win against. and a dragon that loses its power altogether when a woman of God is dropped into your life. I mean, man, guys, I wasn't even. It's just, I don't know. If anything I'm saying is, if you're relating to any of this, please reach out and let me know. I would love to hear from you again. But this is just my story, so hopefully it helps. He says in the New Testament, the Greek word sometimes translated lust can indicate holy passion as well as degrading desires. Consider a congregant confession to his pastor, "I'm consumed by lust." If he means I'm consumed by sinful desire and sexual greed, a minister should never reply, "Well, then you should get married." Again, I would disagree with the statement. He says, "I'm consumed by," the congregant saying, "I'm consumed by lust." If he means consumed by sinful desire and sexual greed, this guy's saying the minister should never reply, "Well, then you should get married." I would say, hey, maybe your sexual desires are God's indicator to you that you're not meant to live single. Have you ever thought of that? Maybe you're not meant to live without having a sexual relationship. There's a mind-blowing hypothesis. Maybe you're supposed to get married, buddy. And instead of trying to get married, you're just sitting here drinking, awful water, instead of choosing God's road for marriage, which is, might I add, way better. It's a way better way to live. And yet, rather than choose God's road, you're sitting here doing this awful, immoral, sinful thing that's hurting your relationship with God and other people. And you're choosing that over the way that God designed, the narrow way that leads to life, right? Ugh. So I definitely disagree with him here. The minister should absolutely say you should get married and stop doing that. And by the way, I think you'll find, young sir, that when you meet a woman who you really love, suddenly pornography, that dragon, seems more like a mouse. And it's really not that hard to beat. It loses its power. It loses its fangs. It loses its teeth. Pornography does, when you have a real healthy relationship with a flesh and blood woman, guys. Because again, there are two reasons for that. Often, pornography addiction is fueled by a desire for connection. And so once you have the genuine connection with a woman, a lot of that, a lot of the pornography struggle loses its power because it's not just sexual addiction. It's addiction to a connection you feel like you get with another woman by looking at porn. So when you actually have the real sexual connection with a woman, I'm sorry, not sexual, when you actually have a real connection with a woman, and you really grow to love her and care about her, suddenly your drive to look at other women is totally gone, friends. And number two, the dragon also gets defanged because you would never go back to that dragon and hurt the woman you love. You would never do that, right? There's something in you because you love this woman, you care about her. Even if that dragon was difficult, even if you wanted to go back to that sin, to return to that vomit, as scripture would say, you would never do it, even if you wanted to, because you would never hurt your wife. But again, I would argue you don't want to go back to the vomit because you now have a 3-course meal, or the potential for a 3-course meal should you actually marry this woman, right? And so, yeah, I just don't agree with this guy's worldview here. He says counseling someone consumed by sexual greed to get married is like encouraging a man who regularly shoots his neighbors with an airsoft gun to register for a firearm. Okay, I do agree that sexual sin, the consequences of sexual sin are exponentially larger once you cross the line into marriage. For example, if you have a habit of sleeping around and you're a single man, you're still heaping death and destruction on your own head and harming women and stuff like that, and you're really experiencing a less than the best sexual experience. You're not having any emotional connection with these people. There's no actual intimacy occurring here. It's just a physical release. So all of that is true. But it becomes worse if you carry that into your marriage and suddenly you're sleeping on multiple women, and you have a wife, which is just exponentially worse. And the consequences are bigger because not only is your conscience going to assault you with renewed force and vigor in a way that you never experienced when you were single, but you're destroying your wife. You're destroying her. I mean, raise your hand if you're listening to me in the car, wherever you are, if you've seen a woman her life has been destroyed by a man who was cheating on her. I mean, my hand's up. I've seen so many women like that. And so I absolutely agree that, sexual sin, using this guy's analogy, post-marriage is a firearm and not an airsoft gun. I absolutely agree with that. But what I'm saying is it's a firearm that you would never hurt anybody with because it has no power. It has no power. At least if you're like me. Again, I know there are people who are not like me, who have different stories and who my advice is not good for, and this will not work for you. So by all means, if you're not like me, turn this show off and please go listen to a Christian who actually is giving you advice that helps you live according to the way that God has designed you to live. Absolutely. But I'm not unique here, guys. Not unique. And so, man, just to recap, pornography, sexual sin, sexual temptation loses its teeth, loses its power when you actually have a real connection with a woman. That's for me, the only thing that worked. The only thing. Do you guys understand how many things I tried from the ages of, 14 to 20 to get rid of pornography temptation and sexual temptation and hookup temptation and sexual temptation of all kinds? Do you realize how many roads I took and tried? Desperately tried these methods, and none of them worked except the one I'm telling you right now, a real connection with a real woman. That's really what God's designed you for. And so attempting to, fix that without God's antidote, I think is stupid and a fool's errand. He says, we'd never recommend marriage to a compulsive liar as a way of remedying his dishonesty, given the promises made to love and honor one's spouse. Lying within marriage is especially diabolical. So too sexual greed, which often sources pornography for inspiration. It's dehumanizing for the spouse who's used as a catharsis for the other's sexual uncleanness. His quote here is, so often Christians overwhelmed by sexual sin are practically shoved down the aisle by their church communities. I do not see this as true. I don't see people shoved towards the aisle in any respect, in any way, by the modern day church. Instead, I see people encouraged to, not get married at all in favor of what the church terms a life in service to the Lord. But really what they mean is a life, of stupidly picking battles with gigantic dragons. Pornography is one of them. Yikes, friends. This really, man, of all of the teachings, I think in the modern day church, this one has the potential to wreak the most havoc. One of the teachings in the modern day church that is so wrong and has the potential to wreck more people's lives than ever is this one right here. He continues on, through Paul, the Holy Spirit forbids making any provision for sexual desires. Romans 13:14. They must be starved, and we can't starve them by feeding them the blessings that belong to faithfulness. Okay, they must not be starved. I think that's a bad analogy. You don't starve sexual desire. It's not how you do it. You don't suppress sexual desire, because sexual desire, friend, is stronger than you, because God's purpose is stronger than you. And God's sexual desire is part of his purpose placed on your life, indicating to you that you need to live married. It's part of it. It's one of the things that can indicate to you that. So you don't starve God's indicators to you and try to, satiate them with immoral things. You choose God's road, which is marriage. I don't think this is that complicated. This guy, for some reason, keeps presuming and assuming that sexuality is a battle that can be beaten. I don't think many men can beat that. I don't, just personally, I don't. I've not seen that many men, sir, who can beat that dragon. I think there are some battles, again, like J.R.R. Tolkien, from which a man must flee in order to win. That's how you win, is by not fighting that dragon. Sexual sin is one of those things. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode. I hope it's actually ministered to your spirit, giving you hope, and giving you not only hope, but a way of dealing with your sexual problems. And because, man, I think I see a lot of men who just make excuses for themselves, and they just live in sexual sin for 10 years. Just, repenting and apologizing over and over and over again, but the behavior's not changing, and they really, really want to change. But they they either make excuses for themselves, or they just keep doing it over and over like a dog returning to vomit, and none of the methods that they try to get out of that sexual sin work. And here I am just offering you one last ray of hope here. If you have problems with pornography or sexual sin of any kind, try this. See if it works. Because it did for me. So thank you guys for listening today. Hope you've enjoyed. Please let me know what you thought of the episode through the link in the show notes. You can send me that personalized audio voice message. Would love to hear from you that way. make it feel super connected to you as an audience member and make the podcasting system two-way. You can also follow the show on Instagram and Facebook if you're interested in the content we post there as well. So thank you guys so much for listening today, and we will talk to you all next time.